They say you never really know a man until you've shared a patrol car with him for a 12-hour shift. It's a rolling confessional, a pressure cooker, a tiny air-conditioned bubble of reality where the distance between a life-or-death decision and a complaint about a stale donut is exactly 0. You learn a man's tells. You learn the rhythm of his breathing when things get tense. You learn whether he's the kind of guy who will have your back when the chips are down, or the kind who's just counting the hours until his pension kicks in. For 15 years, I thought I was a pretty good judge of character. Then Daniel Thorne came to town. He didn't just arrive, he descended upon our dusty little corner of Nevada like a legend walking out of a movie. We heard the stories for weeks before he even showed up. Daniel Thorne, the hero cop from Chicago PD. The guy who single-handedly took down the Wicker Park slasher. The officer who walked into a hostage situation at a bank with a cold pizza and walked out 20 minutes later with the gunman in cuffs. The stories were insane, the kind of stuff you see on TV, not the kind that happens in real life. Our captain, Jacoby, was practically giddy, telling us how lucky we were to get a cop of Thorne's caliber. Said he was burned out on the big city and was looking for a quieter life after a messy divorce. It sounded plausible. We get guys like that sometimes. Hotshot city cops who think they want peace and quiet until the silence and the heat start to cook their brains. Most of them don't last 6 months, but when I met Thorne, I thought he'd be different. He was maybe 40, tall, with the kind of calm, steady gray eyes that seem to see right through you. He had a firm handshake and a quiet charisma that filled a room. He wasn't arrogant or boastful. He listened more than he talked, and when he did talk, it was with a low, measured confidence. He looked, for all the world, like the perfect cop. On that first day, standing next to him in the briefing room, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. I was tired of breaking in rookies. Finally, I'd have a real partner, a pro. Our first shift together started like any other. The morning was a slow crawl of mundane calls, a fender bender at the intersection by the diner, a complaint about some kids skateboarding in the church parking lot, the usual rhythm of a small town. Thorne handled it all with a detached, effortless competence. He was polite, professional, and immaculate. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his boots gleamed, and his equipment sat on his belt with a kind of military precision I hadn't seen since the academy. It was in the car, during the long silences between calls, that I felt the first tiny, inexplicable splinter of doubt. It was the radio. When I made a call, it was muscle memory. Unit 7 to dispatch. We are 10-8 from the 415 at Main and 2nd, returning to patrol. It's a verbal shorthand, fluid and informal from years of use. When Thorne made his first call, it was different. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7 Adam," he said, his voice perfectly clear, perfectly modulated. "Be advised, we have cleared the scene. Status is Code 4, returning to assigned sector. Over." It was perfect. Too perfect. It was the exact wording from the state training manual, the kind of formal, stilted language no street cop ever actually uses. It sounded like he'd memorized it from a book, not lived it. I glanced over at him. He was staring straight ahead, his expression unreadable. "7 Adam?" I asked, a small smile on my face. "A little formal for around here, isn't it?" He turned his head and gave me a calm, practiced smile. Force of habit. Chicago's a stickler for a procedure on the wire, trying to adapt. It made sense. Of course it did. Different department, different rules. I let it go. Later that afternoon, we got a call for a domestic disturbance. A couple, high on something, screaming at each other in a trailer park on the edge of town. It was our bread and butter, messy, loud, and sad. When we got there, I went into my usual routine, separating the parties, talking in a low, calm voice, trying to be the quiet in their storm. Thorne, however, was a statue. He stood just inside the doorway, his arms crossed, his gray eyes scanning the room. He wasn't watching the couple, he was watching me. He watched how I positioned myself, how I used my hands, how I modulated my voice. He wasn't acting like a partner backing me up. He was like an auditor, a scientist observing a specimen. There was a cold, analytical detachment in his posture that was deeply unsettling. The situation de-escalated, as it usually does, and we left. Back in the car, he was the first to speak. "You did well," he said. "You left yourself an exit route and kept your hands visible. Good de-escalation." It felt less like a compliment from a partner and more like a performance review from a superior officer. A very, very strange superior officer. The rest of the day was quiet. We drove, we watched the endless desert roll by, and I started noticing other small things. The way he checked his reflection in the car window instead of turning to look at things. The way he never talked about his past unless I asked a direct question, and then the answers would come out smooth and polished like a pre-written press release. The story of the bank hostage situation? He told it exactly the way the news reports had, with no personal details, no sweat, no fear. It was just a story. As the sun began to set, casting those long, dramatic shadows across the highway, I pulled up to the cheap motel where he was staying until he found a place. "Good shift," he said, opening the door. He gave me another one of those perfect, calibrated smiles. "See you tomorrow, Callahan." He got out and walked toward his room without a backward glance. I watched him go, this hero cop from Chicago. Everything about him was right. Everything was by the book. He was the best partner I could have asked for. So why, as I drove away into the deepening twilight, did I have the cold, sickening feeling that I had just spent 12 hours sitting next to a complete and total stranger? The next morning, I told myself I was being an idiot. A first-class, professional-grade idiot. The guy's a decorated hero from a major metropolitan police force. Of course, his radio procedure's going to be different. Of course, he's going to be more analytical. The stakes in Chicago are a hell of a lot higher than a couple of kids on skateboards. I was acting like a small-town cop, suspicious of the new guy from the big city. It was petty. It was provincial. I resolved to go into day 2 with a clean slate and give the man the respect his record deserved. That resolution lasted until about 11:30 a.m. The morning was dead quiet. Not a single call. To kill the time, we swung by the county firing range, a dusty patch of land with a few rusty targets and a shipping container for a supply shed. It was a chance to burn through some department-mandated ammo and break the monotony. I was a decent shot. After 15 years, you find a comfortable rhythm. You learn to manage the recoil, to control your breathing. It becomes second nature. Thorne picked up his Glock from the lockbox, and the first thing I noticed was his grip. It was a textbook, competition-style grip, flawless and rigid. He took his stance, feet perfectly shoulder-width apart, and raised the weapon. And then he fired. It wasn't just the accuracy, though every single one of his first 10 shots was a perfect bullseye, chewing a single ragged hole in the center of the paper target. It was the economy of motion, the cold, reptilian stillness between each shot. There was no flinch, no adjustment, just a smooth mechanical cycle. Bang, the slide racks back, the muzzle barely rises, it returns to target, bang, repeat. It wasn't the way a street cop shoots. Street cops are trained for combat accuracy in chaotic situations. Thorne shot like a surgeon operating a scalpel. He shot like a man who kills things for a living and does so with a profound lack of emotion. "You're a hell of a shot," I said, my own target looking embarrassingly sloppy by comparison. "They had a great range program back in the 18th District," he replied without looking at me, reloading his magazine with the same fluid, practiced efficiency. "Lots of practice." I nodded, but my cop brain was already making a list, and I didn't like the items on it. Item number 1, radio procedure like a robot. Item number 2, shoots like a trained assassin. I told myself to stop. I was building a conspiracy theory out of nothing. We got back in the car. The silence felt different now, heavier. I decided to try a different approach. Small talk, test the backstory. I'd spent an hour the night before on my laptop looking up articles about his famous cases, reading about the Chicago districts. "You know," I started, trying to sound casual, "I was reading up on that Wicker Park slasher case last night. That was you, right? Front page news." "A long time ago," he said, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Still, crazy stuff. Must have been tough, working out of that precinct on North Avenue, right in the thick of it." I held my breath. It was a deliberate mistake, a small one. According to the city records I'd found, the 18th District headquarters wasn't on North Avenue. It was on West Division Street, a significant distance away. It was an easy, offhand correction for anyone who had actually worked there, the kind of detail that becomes part of your DNA. Thorne was silent for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "It was tough being right there." My blood went cold. He didn't just miss the correction. He agreed with my lie. A real Chicago cop would have laughed and said, "Nah, we were over on Division, thank God." Thorne just accepted it. It was a small thing, a tiny crack in the facade, but it was there. My mental list grew. Item number 3. Doesn't know the geography of his own precinct. The final piece of the puzzle for day 2 came when we stopped for coffee. I paid, and as I handed him his cup, our fingers brushed. His hands were smooth. Not just clean, smooth. There were no calluses, no rough spots, no tiny faded scars that accumulate over years of cuffing suspects, clearing jams on the range and getting into scuffles. He had the hands of a professor or a software engineer, not a 15-year veteran of one of the toughest police departments in the country. Item number 4, hands of a civilian. That evening, I dropped him off at his motel. He gave me the same calm smile, the same professional nod. "Good shift, Callahan." I watched him walk to his door, number 12, at the end of the row. This man, who was a perfect marksman, who had the backstory of a hero, but who didn't know his own station's address and had hands that had never seen a day of real police work. The feeling from the day before returned, but it was no longer a vague unease. It was a sharp, specific, and terrifying suspicion. I wasn't partners with a hero cop from Chicago. I was partners with an imposter, and I had absolutely no idea who he was or what he wanted. As I drove away, I didn't go home. I went to my office, turned on my computer, and closed the door. My days of giving Daniel Thorne the benefit of the doubt were over. My investigation had just begun. My office was a pit of stale coffee and low-grade paranoia. The screen of my computer cast a pale, lonely glow in the otherwise dark room. For 3 hours, I dug. I wasn't using police databases, not yet. That would leave a digital footprint, an official inquiry linked to my name. If Thorne was somehow connected, if Jacoby was protecting him, a formal search would be like setting off a flare. So I stuck to the public domain. News archives, social media, public records. I was hunting for the ghost of Daniel Thorne, and he was a ghost. For a cop credited with taking down two of Chicago's most infamous criminals, his digital footprint was practically non-existent. There were the official press articles, of course. In every one, he was quoted, his actions described in heroic detail. But the photos were always the same, grainy, taken from a distance, or showing him from the back, a broad-shouldered silhouette in a crowd of other cops. There was no Facebook profile, no LinkedIn, no smiling photos with his ex-wife on Instagram. Nothing. It was like trying to grab smoke. The man's entire public identity seemed to be constructed from a handful of press clippings. I went into the third shift with a knot of ice in my stomach. The easy camaraderie of a patrol partnership was gone, replaced by a tense, brittle silence. I was hyper-aware of every move he made, every word he said. I wasn't his partner anymore. I was his observer, and I think on some level he knew it. The easy, practiced smiles he'd given me the first 2 days were gone. Now, when he looked at me, his gray eyes were cold, calculating, and utterly unreadable. The morning was another slow one. I think the silence was getting to him. He needed to be in control, to be the one steering the conversation. "Something on your mind, Callahan?" he asked, his voice smooth as polished riverstone. "Just tired," I lied. "Long night." "I hear that," he said, and the conversation died, the unspoken tension hanging between us like a thick fog. Then, just after noon, the call we all dread came over the radio. A multi-vehicle pileup on the interstate, 10 miles east of town. A semi had jackknifed in the rain, and at least 4 other cars were involved. We were the closest unit. I hit the lights and siren, and we flew. The scene was pure chaos. Twisted metal, shattered glass, the smell of gasoline and burnt rubber hanging heavy in the air. People were screaming, crying. One car was on its side, smoke pouring from the engine block. My training kicked in, a blessed relief from the paranoia. This was real. This was something I knew how to handle. "I'll take the semi and the overturned sedan," I yelled to Thorne over the din. "You start on triage with the others. Keep everyone back." He just gave a sharp, single nod and moved off. For the next 20 minutes, it was a blur of activity. I was calming a panicked mother, putting out an engine fire with my extinguisher, directing traffic. It was what I did. I was pulling a dazed teenager from a smoking minivan when I glanced over to see what Thorne was doing. He was at the sedan that was on its side. The driver, a woman, was trapped inside, conscious but pinned by the crushed door frame. The fire department was still 5 minutes out. The smoke from the engine was getting thicker, turning from white to a greasy, ominous black. I saw Thorne say something to the woman. Then he turned his attention to the door. He wasn't pulling on the handle. He placed his hands on the seam where the door met the frame, near the lock mechanism. And then he did something I still can't fully explain. It wasn't brute force. He didn't just rip it open. He shifted his weight, and with a small, precise, brutally efficient movement, a targeted application of leverage that seemed to defy physics, he forced the lock. I heard the sharp, sickening crack of the mechanism breaking from 30 feet away. The door popped open. He pulled the woman out just as the first licks of flame started to curl up from under the hood. It was an incredible act. He had just saved her life. It was heroic, and it was the most terrified I had been in my entire life. No cop is trained to do that. That wasn't a police academy move. That wasn't something you learn on the street. That was the kind of knowledge a military special operator might have, or a high-level car thief, or a saboteur. It was the move of someone who understood stress points and structural weaknesses. It was the move of a professional who was not a professional police officer. My mental list was complete. The final item was written in bold. Item number 5, possesses skills and knowledge far outside the scope of law enforcement. Later, after the scene was cleared and we were back in the cruiser, the adrenaline wearing off, I looked at him. "That was some move with that car door," I said, my voice quiet. "Saved her life. Never seen a cop do that before." He turned to look at me, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a flash of annoyance, a crack in the perfect, calm facade. He had made a mistake. He had revealed a card he hadn't meant to show. "You pick things up," he said, his voice a low, dangerous murmur. "Saw a firefighter do something similar once. Just got lucky." He was lying. We both knew it, and he knew that I knew. The game was up. The pretense was gone. That evening, I didn't say a word as I dropped him at his motel. I just watched him get out and walk to his room. The question was no longer if he was an imposter. The only question left was what he was, and I knew I wouldn't find the answer in a public record search. The answer was in that motel room, room 12, and tonight, after he was asleep, I was going to get it. Patience is a virtue I rarely possess, but that night I was a goddamn statue. I sat in my unmarked car in the parking lot of a 24-hour laundromat across the street from the Sleepwell Motel, a sad, peeling monument to mediocrity. I watched the light in room 12, Thorne's room, for 2 hours. I nursed a cold coffee and let the paranoia sharpen my senses. At 1:30 a.m., the light went out. I gave him another full hour, imagining him sinking into the deep, dreamless sleep of a man with no conscience. Then I moved. Breaking into a cheap motel room isn't as dramatic as it sounds. The locks are a joke, an insult to the very concept of security. I didn't smash a window or kick down the door. I used a simple lockpick set I'd kept from my early days as a detective, a tool I hadn't touched in years. The skill was still there, a ghost in my fingertips. The lock clicked open with a sound that was deafeningly loud in the dead quiet of the night. I slipped inside, closing the door behind me without letting it latch. The room smelled of stale air and industrial cleaner. It was sterile, impersonal. The bed was neatly made. A single paperback novel sat on the nightstand. There were no family photos, no personal trinkets, no clutter. It wasn't the room of a man settling into a new life. It was the room of a man who could pack up and disappear in under 5 minutes. It confirmed everything I already suspected. I used a small pen light, its beam a nervous dancing circle in the darkness. I moved with a silence born of years of practice. I started with his duffel bag, which was sitting at the foot of the bed. The clothes inside were generic, new, a mix of civilian wear and department-approved tactical gear. Nothing. I checked the drawers of the cheap particle board dresser. Empty. I checked under the mattress. Nothing. It was like the man himself, a perfect, impenetrable surface. I was about to give up, to chalk it up to my own paranoia, when my light caught a small scuff mark on the worn carpet by the closet. It looked like something heavy had been dragged there. I knelt down and ran my fingers over the area. Underneath the thin, threadbare carpet, my fingers found the edge of a loose floorboard. Bingo. I pried it up with the blade of my multi-tool. Beneath it was a small canvas satchel. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. I lifted it out. It was heavy. I unzipped it on the floor. My blood ran cold. Inside was a ghost's toolkit, a silenced Sig Sauer P226 pistol, far from standard police issue. 2 spare passports, 1 Canadian, 1 British, both with Thorne's picture but with different names. A stack of cash, bound in rubber bands, at least $20,000. and underneath it all, a slim black file folder. I opened the folder, and my breath caught in my throat. My own face stared back at me from a black and white photograph clipped to the first page. It was a full workup. My service record, my commendations, my reprimands, my ex-wife's name and address, my patrol routes, my usual coffee stops, a detailed psychological profile that described me as predictable, suffering from low-grade burnout, but with a strong, if outdated, sense of duty. It was a blueprint of my life, of my weaknesses. They hadn't just sent an imposter. They had sent a man who knew me better than I knew myself. I was so absorbed in the horrifying violation of the file that I almost didn't hear it. The sound of a car engine, a car pulling into the motel parking lot. Headlights swept across the thin curtains of the window. Panic, cold and absolute, seized me. I scrambled, shoving the folder back into the bag, but there was no time to put it back under the floor. I heard the jingle of keys outside the door to room 12. Thorne. He was back. I did the only thing I could. I grabbed the folder, slid the floorboard back into place as best I could, and dove under the cheap, rickety bed, pulling the dusty bedskirt down. The door opened. Heavy boots stepped inside. I could see them under the gap, the same gleaming, polished boots from our shift. I held my breath, my body rigid, my Glock pressed against my chest. I was trapped. Thorne walked across the room. I heard him open the small fridge, the clink of a bottle. He was humming a tune, quiet and tuneless. He stood in the middle of the room for a long minute, and I was sure he could hear the frantic pounding of my heart. I was sure he knew I was there. Then he swore softly. "Forgot the damn file," he muttered to himself. He turned and walked back out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. I heard his car door open and close, and the engine start up again. He drove away. I didn't move for a full minute. I waited, listening to the silence before I finally slid out from under the bed, covered in dust and cold sweat. I didn't dare touch anything else. I slipped back out of the room and into the night, the black folder clutched in my hand like a venomous snake. I didn't stop driving until I was 20 miles out of town, parked on a deserted lookout point. In the dim light of my car's dome light, I examined my prize. It wasn't just a file on me, it was a mission briefing, and on the last page, under Objective, was the real reason Thorne was here. It listed a name and an address. It wasn't my name. It was the name of a protected witness from a federal racketeering case I had worked 5 years ago, a man named Julian Croft, a man I had personally convinced to testify, whose testimony had put away a dozen very dangerous men, a man who had been officially disappeared by the Witness Protection Program. Thorne wasn't here to replace me. He was here to use me, to use my position, my knowledge of the area, to find and eliminate the one loose end from a case I thought was long since buried. The threat wasn't just to me anymore. It was to a ghost I had helped create. Dawn is a brutal time of day for a man running on no sleep and a belly full of cold coffee and dread. The sun rose over the distant mountains, painting the desert in strokes of gold and rose, but the beauty was lost on me. My passenger seat was covered in the pages of the folder I'd stolen from Thorne's room, a blueprint for a murder. My murder, if necessary, but I was just a stepping stone. The real target was a ghost named Julian Croft. My mind raced, connecting the dots. The people Croft had put away 5 years ago were finally coming for their revenge. They couldn't use their own muscle. That would lead right back to them. So they hired a contractor, a professional, a man who could wear a police uniform like a second skin, who could bypass all the security of the system because he was on the inside. A man like Thorne. His transfer to my precinct, his partnership with me. It was all a meticulously planned infiltration. He was using the shield of my badge to hunt for a man the system had sworn to protect. The problem was, how do you find a man who doesn't exist? The Witness Protection Program isn't a joke. It's a federal firewall designed to turn people into ghosts. Their old identities are buried. Their new ones are built with layers of fabricated history. Finding a WITSEC protectee is harder than finding a needle in a continent-sized haystack. For a county cop like me, it was impossible. I had no access, no jurisdiction, no right to even ask the questions. Any official inquiry I made would hit a brick wall, and worse, it would trip an alarm. The Marshal's Service would know someone was sniffing around, and if I was asking, Jacoby and Thorne would find out. I was stumped. I had the why, but I had no where. I had to go to work. I had to get back in that patrol car and sit next to the man who was probably planning how to dispose of my body. It was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. I walked into the station, my face a mask of professional calm, my heart a frantic bird beating against my ribs. Thorne was already there, leaning against the fender of the cruiser, sipping a coffee. He looked at me and his eyes were different. The calculating neutrality was gone, replaced by a look of cold, sharp assessment. He knew. He must have gone back to his room and found the folder missing. He knew I had it. The game had changed. We both knew the other was an enemy, but we were trapped in the roles our uniforms assigned us. The 8 hours of our shift stretched before me like a prison sentence. The silence in the car was a physical thing. It had weight and texture. We drove for an hour without saying a word, the unspoken accusations screaming between us. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice casual but laced with ice. "You know, Callahan," he began, not looking at me. I seemed to have misplaced some sensitive paperwork I brought with me from Chicago. Old case files. You haven't seen a black folder lying around, have you? My blood ran cold. This was the test. "Can't say that I have," I replied, my own voice sounding unnervingly steady. "If it was sensitive, you should probably report it missing." He turned his head slowly and looked at me. A thin, predatory smile touched his lips. "Oh, I don't think that will be necessary," he said. "I have a feeling it will turn up." We were two sharks in a bathtub, circling each other, waiting for the first bite. Every call we took, every traffic stop, was thick with menace. I felt his eyes on me constantly, watching my every move, waiting for me to slip up. My only hope was a long shot, a name from my past, Frank O'Connell, a retired U.S. Marshal who had been the lead on the Julian Croft relocation. Frank was old school, a man who operated on favors and gut feelings. He owed me one, a big one. I had covered for his rookie son years ago on a DUI charge that would have ended his career before it began. During our lunch break, I used a burner phone I'd bought for cash that morning at a gas station. I dialed the number from memory. He answered on the fourth ring. "O'Connell." His voice was a gravelly bark. "Frank, it's Sam Callahan." Silence, then a weary sigh. "Sam, this isn't a line you should be calling me on. This isn't a conversation we should be having." "I have no choice, Frank. It's about the Croft case. That case is dead and buried," he snapped. "Someone's digging it up," I said, my voice low and urgent. "Someone professional. They've infiltrated my department and they are hunting him. I'm the only thing standing in their way and I'm running blind. I'm not asking for a location. I'm not asking you to break the law. I just need a breadcrumb, a place to start. You owe me, Frank." I could almost hear the old man wrestling with his conscience, with his oath. The silence stretched for a full minute. "He's not Julian Croft anymore," Frank finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "And he's not in the desert. They moved him somewhere wet, somewhere green. He started a new business, fishing charters." "Where, Frank?" I pressed. "A little town on the Oregon coast," he rasped. "Place called Port Jericho. That's all you get, Sam. And you and I, we never had this conversation. You call this number again, it won't exist. Be careful. These people don't leave loose ends." He hung up. Port Jericho, Oregon. I had it. A destination, a chance. I felt a surge of adrenaline, of hope. I looked out the window of the cruiser at the endless, sun-bleached expanse of the Nevada desert. My mind was 1,000 miles away, on a foggy coastline I had never seen. But then reality crashed back in. I was here, stuck in this car, shackled to the man who was hunting Croft. I had the destination, but the killer was sitting 3 feet away from me. How the hell was I going to get to Oregon before he did? The rest of the shift was a masterclass in psychological warfare. We were 2 actors in a very bad play, and the audience was just us. We performed our duties, ran a few minor traffic stops, and spoke to each other only when absolutely necessary, using the clipped, formal language of strangers. Every time I glanced at him, his cold gray eyes were already on me. He knew I had the folder. I knew he was an imposter, and we both knew that as soon as our shift ended, the play would be over, and the real violence would begin. I was trapped. I couldn't go back to my house. He knew where I lived. I couldn't go to the station. Jacoby was there. I was in a cage, and the tiger was sitting next to me. My mind was a frantic engine running through and discarding 100 bad plans. I couldn't just pull my gun. He was likely faster and definitely better trained in close-quarters combat. I couldn't just make a run for it. He'd put a bullet in my back before I took 3 steps. I had to separate us. I had to choose the ground. My ground. As we headed back toward town with less than an hour left in the shift, a plan began to form. A desperate, ugly plan, but the only one I had. "I gotta make a stop at the courthouse," I said, my voice sounding unnervingly normal. "Need to log that bag of weed from the traffic stop yesterday into the evidence locker before I sign out. Paperwork's a killer." It was a plausible, mind-numbingly boring piece of police bureaucracy. The county courthouse had a secure evidence drop in the basement of its multi-story parking garage. It was a place Thorne would have no reason to be suspicious of. He just nodded, his face a mask of indifference. "No problem." We pulled into the garage. It was late evening, and the place was mostly empty, a cavern of concrete and cold fluorescent light. The air smelled of exhaust fumes and dampness. Every sound echoed, amplified. I parked the cruiser in our designated spot near the stairwell leading to the basement. This was it, the point of no return. "I'll be quick," I said, opening my door. My heart was a trip hammer. "I'll come with you," Thorne said, his voice flat. It wasn't a suggestion. He was opening his own door. He wasn't going to let me out of his sight. My plan had accounted for this. In fact, it depended on it. I got out of the car, holding the small sealed evidence bag. As Thorne swung his legs out of the passenger side, his attention focused on getting out of the vehicle, I moved. I didn't draw my weapon. I didn't yell a challenge. I did the last thing he would expect from a predictable cop. I slammed my car door shut, rounded the hood in 2 long strides, and threw my entire body weight into his open door, smashing it back into him as he was halfway out. The impact was brutal. The edge of the door caught him in the ribs and knee, folding him back into the car with a sharp grunt of pain and surprise. It wouldn't keep him down for long, but I didn't need long. I needed a head start. I ran. I didn't run for the evidence locker. I ran for the main stairwell, the one leading up. I took the stairs, 3 at a time, my boots hammering on the concrete. I heard a furious roar from behind me, the sound of the car door being kicked open. He was coming. The chase was a blur of echoing footsteps and ragged breathing. I burst out onto the 3rd level of the garage, my mind racing. He would expect me to run for the exit, to try and get to the street. I did the opposite. I sprinted deeper into the garage, weaving between the concrete pillars. I fumbled in my pocket for the keys to my personal vehicle, my old, beat-up pickup truck, which I deliberately parked here this morning instead of at the station. I saw it at the far end of the row, 50 yards away. It felt like a mile. I heard his footsteps behind me, fast and steady. He was closing the distance. I risked a glance over my shoulder. He was moving with a terrifying speed and purpose, his face a mask of cold fury. The hero cop facade was gone, burned away. What was left was the predator. He was reaching inside his jacket, going for his weapon. I dove behind a concrete pillar just as he fired. The shot wasn't a loud bang like my Glock. It was a soft, muffled foot, a silenced weapon. The bullet whizzed past my head and ricocheted off a steel pipe on the ceiling. I didn't wait for a second shot. I scrambled from behind the pillar and made a final, desperate sprint for my truck. I hit the unlock button on my key fob, ripped the door open, and threw myself inside. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. Another phut sound, and the driver's side window next to my head exploded into a spiderweb of fractured glass. The engine roared to life. I slammed the truck into reverse, stomped on the gas, and peeled out of the parking spot with a scream of tortured tires. I cranked the wheel, shifted into drive, and floored it, the old truck fishtailing as it shot toward the exit ramp. In my rearview mirror, I saw him. Thorne, standing there in the middle of the garage, his silenced pistol held low. He wasn't even aiming anymore. He just watched me go, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't even angry anymore. He was just watching. I sped out of the garage and into the city streets, my heart about to beat its way out of my chest. I had done it. I was free. I had a head start. But as I looked in the mirror again at the dark, empty mouth of the parking garage, a cold dread washed over me. I hadn't beaten him. I hadn't won anything. I'd just fired the starting pistol on a race across the country. A race against a professional killer who knew my name, my face, and my destination. A race I had absolutely no idea how to win. The first 100 miles were a blur of adrenaline and speed. I drove my old pickup like I'd stolen it, pushing the aging engine until it screamed, my eyes constantly flicking between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. Every pair of headlights felt like a threat, every shadow on the road a potential ambush. The air rushing in through the shattered driver's side window was a constant, screaming reminder of how close I had come to dying in that garage. But the adrenaline eventually burned away, leaving behind the cold, hard ash of reality. I wasn't a cop anymore. I was a fugitive. And I was thinking like one. I pulled off the interstate onto a dark, deserted county road in Northern California, miles from anywhere. I killed the engine and sat in the sudden, profound silence. My truck, my trusty companion for the last 10 years, was a liability. Its plates were registered to me. By now, Jacoby would have put out a bolo, not a public one maybe, but an internal one, flagged for officer assist or mental instability. Every cop in 3 states would be looking for this truck. My phone, my credit cards, My entire life was a digital breadcrumb trail leading right to me. I drove until I found an all-night ATM in a small, forgotten town. I withdrew every cent I could, $800. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Then I drove another 20 miles, found a desolate logging trail, and pulled my truck in as deep as the trees would allow. I took my go bag, my Glock, and the folder. I left the keys in the ignition. For a moment, I just looked at the old truck, a repository of a decade of my life. Then I turned and walked away without looking back. A mile down the road, I stood by a rushing creek. I took out my smartphone, the device that connected me to everything. I smashed it on a large, flat rock again and again until it was nothing but a pile of plastic and shattered glass. I threw the pieces into the fast-moving water. I was a ghost now. No car, no phone, no name. The next 24 hours were a lesson in invisibility. A long-haul trucker gave me a ride 100 miles north. I paid cash for a bus ticket that got me halfway through Oregon. In a dreary, rain-soaked town, I found a used car lot where the owner had shifty eyes and didn't ask for ID if you paid in cash. I bought a 20-year-old rust bucket of a station wagon for $600. It was anonymous. It was perfect. It was in a Greasy Spoon diner somewhere south of Portland that my world truly ended. The small television in the corner was tuned to a national news network, and I saw my face. It was my official department photo looking stern and professional. The chyron beneath it read, "Rogue Nevada Deputy Wanted for Violent Assault." A well-coiffed anchor woman was detailing the official story. How decorated Deputy Samuel Callahan had, for unknown reasons, suffered a psychotic break. How he had brutally assaulted his new partner, the celebrated hero Daniel Thorne, in a parking garage. The report painted Thorne as a victim, a hero who had tried to help a troubled colleague. It mentioned that I was considered armed, unstable, and dangerous. Jacoby and Thorne hadn't just made me a fugitive. They had turned me into a monster. They had weaponized the entire country's law enforcement against me. There was nowhere I could go, no one I could turn to. The story was airtight. My career, my reputation, my life, it was all gone, erased by a 5-minute news segment. The rage I felt was so pure and so cold, it almost made me feel calm. The game had changed again. This wasn't just about protecting a witness anymore. This was about clearing my name. It was about taking them all down. I drove the rest of the way to the coast in a focused, determined haze. The dry, red desert of my home felt like a memory from another life. Here, the air was cold and damp, thick with the smell of salt, pine, and fish. It was a different world, a world of fog and secrets. I rolled into the small harbor town of Port Jericho as dusk was falling. It was a postcard-perfect fishing village with boats bobbing in the marina and quaint little shops lining the main street. It felt peaceful. It felt safe. I knew it was neither. I found a cheap motel on the edge of town, another cash transaction, and waited for morning. At dawn, I was at the docks, nursing a coffee in my car, watching the fishermen prepare their boats. My eyes scanned every sign, every boat name, and then I saw it. At the far end of the marina, a well-maintained charter boat was docked. On a sign hanging from its cabin, painted in clean, simple letters, were the words, "Jericho's Deep Sea Adventures, Captain J. Cole." Julian Croft. I had found him. The race was over. I felt a moment of triumph, but it was instantly replaced by a wave of cold dread. I had found him in less than 3 days, with nothing but a burner phone and a pocket full of cash. Thorne, with the resources of the Phoenix Syndicate behind him, with access to private intelligence and surveillance technology I couldn't even imagine. He wasn't just coming. He was probably already here. The salty, damp air of Port Jericho was a world away from the dry heat of my home, but the feeling was the same. I was being hunted. I spent the first few hours of daylight watching the docks from my rust-bucket car, a ghost observing a life I could never have. I saw him, Captain J. Cole. He moved with the easy, rolling gait of a man who belonged to the sea. He had a beard now, flecked with gray, and the sun and salt had weathered his skin, but it was him, Julian Croft. He looked content. It was a look I was about to shatter. I watched his routine. He'd arrive at dawn, prep his boat, the Sea Serpent, for an hour, then his first charter clients would show up around 7 a.m. My window was that hour. I needed to get to him when he was alone, but before he was surrounded by strangers. Walking up to him on the dock was too risky, too public. Thorne could be anywhere, watching through a rifle scope for all I knew. I had to change the terrain. I had to get him onto his own turf, the water. I found a small, shabby rental shack at the other end of the marina and paid cash for a few hours in a tiny, single-engine motorboat. It was barely more than a dinghy, but it was all I needed. I motored out of the marina, keeping my distance, and watched as the Sea Serpent slipped its moorings and headed out into the open water. A thick morning fog was rolling in, blanketing the coastline in a soft gray curtain. It was perfect cover. I followed his wake, the small motor of my boat buzzing nervously. About 2 miles from shore, in the heart of the fog bank where the world was reduced to a 50-foot circle of gray water and gray sky, he cut his engine to set his lines. This was my chance. I brought my boat alongside his, the rubber bumpers kissing with a soft thud. He heard it, of course. He spun around, a gaff hook, a long, wicked-looking steel spike, in his hands. His face was hard, suspicious. This was a man who had not forgotten how to be afraid. "That's far enough," he barked, his voice raspy from the sea air. "State your business." "Julian," I said, my voice low, "my name is Sam Callahan. 5 years ago I convinced you to testify against the Moretti brothers. I told you the system would protect you." His face went pale under his tan. The gaff hook didn't waver. "I don't know what you're talking about. My name is Cole." "We don't have time for this," I said, my voice urgent. "They've found you. They hired a professional to clean up loose ends. He infiltrated my department. He used me to get here. He's here, Julian, in this town." I saw the flicker of belief in his eyes, the dawning of a nightmare he thought he'd left behind. "How?" he whispered. "It doesn't matter," I said. "We need to go. We need to—" "You're right," a calm voice said from behind me. "You don't have time." I spun around. Standing on the deck of my own tiny boat, having seemingly materialized from the fog, was Daniel Thorne. He must have been hidden under a tarp. He had followed me. He had let me lead him right to his target. His silenced Sig Sauer was in his hand, pointed steadily at my chest. "I have to admit, Callahan," Thorne said, a thin, cruel smile on his lips, "you're less predictable than your profile suggested. Caused me quite a bit of trouble." He gestured with his weapon. "Now, get on his boat, both of you." The next few moments were a blur of cold dread. We were on the deck of the Sea Serpent, miles from shore, trapped in the fog with the killer. This was his stage, a clean, quiet kill with the vastness of the Pacific Ocean to hide the bodies. "The folder, Callahan," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a businesslike tone. "Let's have it." I slowly reached into my jacket and pulled out the dossier. This was the end game. "Now him," Thorne said, nodding toward Croft. "Then you." He took a step forward, raising his weapon to aim at Croft's head. and in that moment I knew I was dead, but I could still do some damage. I lunged, not at Thorn, but at the fishing gear next to me, grabbing a heavy, lead-weighted net and flinging it at him. It was a clumsy, desperate move, but it worked. The net entangled his arms, throwing off his aim. His gun fired with a muffled phut, the bullet burying itself harmlessly in the boat's cabin wall. Croft, seeing his chance, didn't hesitate. He wasn't a fighter, but he was a captain. He lunged for the ship's controls and spun the wheel hard to starboard. The sea serpent lurched violently, throwing all of us across the slick deck. Thorn, tangled in the net, stumbled, his back hitting the low railing. I saw my opening. I scrambled to my feet and crashed into him with all my weight. We went down in a tangle of limbs, the net, and pure, desperate violence. He was stronger than me, his movements precise and deadly even in the chaos. His hands were on my throat, squeezing, his cold gray eyes filled with nothing but methodical purpose. My vision started to swim in black spots. Then, through the ringing in my ears, I heard Croft yell, "Now!" A heavy, wet rope dropped from above, catching Thorn across the shoulders. Croft had released one of the booms. Thorn grunted, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all I needed. I twisted, kicking out, and shoved him with every ounce of strength I had left. He lost his footing on the slick, rocking deck. For a moment, he teetered on the edge, his arms flailing, his eyes wide with the first genuine surprise I had ever seen on his face. And then he was gone, disappearing over the side with a quiet splash into the cold, gray, unforgiven water. We watched the spot where he had vanished. There were a few bubbles, and then nothing but the fog and the sound of the waves. We had won. We stood there on the deck, two battered, exhausted men, breathing in the cold, clean air of the sea. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the plastic-wrapped hard drive I'd taken from the dossier. I handed it to him. "It's all there," I said. "The password is Alina. The FBI contact is Agent Coulson in Vegas. You make the call, Julian. You finish it." He took the drive, his hand closing around it. "What about you?" he asked. "You're a wanted man." "The man they want doesn't exist anymore," I said, looking toward the shore I couldn't see. He disappeared somewhere back in the Nevada desert. I climbed back into my small motorboat. We looked at each other one last time. The cop and the accountant. Two ghosts linked forever by a story no one would ever believe. I turned the key, and the small engine sputtered to life. Without another word, I steered the boat away from the sea serpent and motored off, not toward the shore, but deeper into the heart of the fog until the world and my old life disappeared completely behind me.